I'm Gardiner Vinnedge, and I'm one of the volunteers over at the Historical Society here in North Bend. But I'm here today because I have a special feeling for this place, this site, and this building, because it's associated with the North Bend Timber Company, and my grandfather was one of the principal figures in that company. The North Bend Timber Company started in 1906. It was a classic small logging operation. It was a couple of guys, my grandfather, Webb Vinnedge, and William C. Weeks. And they started logging over on the south side of the valley, up in the hill towards between Cedar Falls and the Milwaukee Tunnel. They built a little town, a little base at what had been Camp 4, and they called it Edgewick. That was a name that was made up of the last part of my grandfather's name, Vinnedge, and Wicks. Mr. Weeks was almost always called Mr. Wicks or Mr. Wick by the Swedish loggers. A big operation there, a couple of mills, a village bunkhouses, a store, a post office, a school district, and they had, perhaps 150 people working for them. The logging industry in the Pacific Northwest had all of its best years in 1917 and 1918, tremendously profitable years. And so it just looked like everything was going to be great. By 1918, Seattle's water needs were growing. The city gradually began building its reservoir bigger and bigger by building a bigger and bigger dam. The logging company was worried about it. It had its pond on Boxley Creek, a little creek that came out of the gravel there, and they had dammed Boxley Creek to make a little mill pond. And so the company had a night watchman out watching the pond on the night of December 22nd, 23rd, and he heard something. And what it was the grinding of rocks and trees and mud as the whole bank of the reservoir let go. And the next morning, people in North Bend began to see pieces of Edgewick floating by on the South Fork. The community was completely destroyed. The mills were completely destroyed, most of the houses carried away. So they abandoned the site of Edgewick, and in 1920 began to move over to open up operations in the Middle Fork. It was reorganized and its name was changed from the North Bend Lumber Company to the North Bend Timber Company. They needed a base for that, of course. They'd lost their town, and they needed a place where they could get their logs loaded onto railroad cars. And this site was the perfect place for that because it was right near both the Milwaukee and the Northern Pacific tracks. In 1924, this building was built, and there were a number of other buildings on the site. It had been a farm. There was an old farmhouse here. And there, in the yard here, you can see rails because this building was their locomotive shed. But they had a number of other buildings on the site too. They had an office building, they had a cookhouse here, and this is where they operated from 1924 to 1944, when the age of the small local family logging company had really passed. And in 1944, my grandfather sold the North Bend Timber Company to the St. Regis Paper Company. But the site continued to be operated, and it has been used for things like a locomotive shed, and it's amazing that it's still here in 2018. I'm just really excited that there's an effort going on to save this building, to move it, to find a new use for it, and to keep it here as a symbol of the great logging period in Snoqualmie Valley history.
The railroad industry and the lumber industry both thrived at one time in our community, and this building represents both of those industries and their rich histories. Our group has some pretty ambitious plans for this locomotive shed. We plan to disassemble it and move it to a new site. We would like to then create a space for artists to be able to come in and create their work. We also need to act quite quickly because the building is slated to be demolished in the summer of 2018. This building is unique as it is the last one of its kind here in our valley, and I hope you will join us on our adventure to try and save this rich piece of history.